While locals dismissed his discovery as an abandoned mining shaft or forgotten root cellar, Jackson Hayes knew the rusted metal door he'd uncovered while clearing stones for a memorial garden wasn't something any ordinary farmer would install. Beneath 8 feet of fertile Illinois soil, the padlocked entrance, concealed within a century-old cornfield, would lead him to unearth secrets that would shatter everything historians thought they knew about America's lost Civil War treasure. 3 weeks of methodical exploration, following the cryptic map left in his father's will, would reveal an underground network containing wealth that wouldn't just transform the Hayes family fortunes, but potentially rewrite a chapter of American history forever. The relentless summer sun beat down on Whispering Oaks Farm, as it had for generations, scorching the swaying corn that had been in the Hayes family since 1865. Long shadows stretched across the rolling fields as the day's brutal heat began its slow retreat. Jackson Hayes removed his sweat-soaked hat and surveyed the verdant vista before him, his weathered face etched with the determination of a man fighting to preserve not just his livelihood, but his family's heritage. At 39, Jackson carried the weight of 4 generations of farmers in the calloused hands that gripped the fence post as he stared across what should have been thriving cornfields. The unexpected death of his father, Robert Hayes, 3 weeks earlier, had transformed his once certain future into a labyrinth of questions and responsibilities. The financial crisis that small family farms had faced for decades had arrived with unforgiving ferocity in central Illinois, turning even the most diligent farmers into casualties of corporate agriculture and mounting debts. 4th mortgage refinancing denied, Jackson muttered to himself, kicking at the rich soil beneath. His boots, the farm's main operations, had fallen to critically low profitability 2 months earlier, forcing him to make impossible decisions about which sections of the 500-acre property would receive investment for the coming season. The eastern field, where his great-grandfather had first planted corn in 1866, was now threatened. The irrigation system needed repairs, and the equipment was aging beyond reasonable maintenance. In the distance, the farmhouse stood as a testament to the Hayes family's resilience, a sprawling 2-story structure of weathered clapboard that had been expanded by each generation. The building had withstood tornadoes, floods, and economic hardships, but now faced a threat more insidious than any before: the slow, relentless progression of bank foreclosure that had swallowed so many neighboring farms. Jackson's wife, Emma, a historical archivist whose expertise had helped preserve local heritage sites, had been analyzing his father's papers and effects for weeks. That morning, she'd spread the latest discoveries across their kitchen table, the same oak surface where his great-grandfather had counted the first harvest profits. "There's something unusual about the contents of your father's lockbox," she'd explained, pointing to a weathered leather journal and folded parchment. "See this hand-drawn map? It shows the farm layout, but with markings that don't correspond to any structures or fields we know. And the journal entries from your great-grandfather mention something called the shelter repeatedly, but never explain what it is." The location she'd identified was in a rarely cultivated corner of the property, an oddly rocky area that his father had always avoided, claiming the soil composition wasn't worth the effort to improve. Jackson had never questioned this assessment until now, when his father's death and the farm's precarious finances forced a reconsideration of every acre. As the sun dipped lower toward the distant tree line, Jackson made his decision. The estate. Lawyer had explained that without significant new revenue, the inheritance taxes alone could force a sale of at least part of the land. His father's mysterious map might be nothing more than an old man's fancy, but Jackson had nothing to lose by investigating. Driving his truck back to the main compound, Jackson passed the collection of outbuildings that housed equipment spanning decades of farming history. The largest structure, a red barn his grandfather had raised in the 1940s, contained not just modern tractors and harvesting equipment, but artifacts from the farm's earliest days, tools and implements that told the story of the Hayes families. Evolution from Civil War veterans to modern farmers. Emma met him on the porch, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, a collection of papers in her hands displaying more historical research. Originally from Chicago, with a master's degree in American history, she'd brought scholarly perspective to the farm's heritage when she married Jackson 12 years earlier. The worry lines around her eyes had deepened in recent weeks as she watched the financial pressure mount following Robert's death. "I've matched some landscape features from the map to current satellite images," she said, handing him a tablet with overlaid photographs. "If I'm right about the scale, whatever your father marked is located in that rocky section near the old oak grove." That evening, they sorted through the equipment stored in his father's workshop, a small room attached to the main barn that Jackson had barely entered since the funeral. Robert Hayes had been something of a collector, preserving tools and memorabilia. Throughout his 78 years, when money was tight and respect for history wasn't just sentiment, but a family obligation. "I remember your grandfather saying Robert was almost obsessive about that eastern section," Emma remarked, as they examined old digging tools. "He'd discourage visitors from wandering too close to it. Everyone just assumed he was being protective of the property lines." Jackson paused, a vague memory surfacing. "Dad used to say there were family matters in that section. I always thought he meant some kind of boundary dispute or water rights issue from the old days." In the back of the workshop, behind carefully preserved tools hung with almost military precision, Jackson noticed a metal ammunition box he hadn't opened in years. The heavy combination lock that had secured it had been removed, though the box itself remained closed. Something about their conversation triggered his curiosity. Inside, he found stacks of his father's military records from Vietnam, detailed. Accounts of operations and locations dating back to 1969. Robert Hayes had documented everything with meticulous precision, a habit Jackson had admired but never fully adopted himself. Beneath these familiar papers, however, lay something unexpected. A sealed envelope with "For my son" written in his father's distinctive handwriting. The letter inside was dated just 3 weeks before his death. "What's this?" Emma asked as Jackson carefully opened the envelope. "Dad never mentioned leaving me a letter," he admitted, unfolding the single page covered in neat penmanship. The contents were brief but startling. "Jackson, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The cancer moved faster than the doctors predicted. There are things about our family and this land that I should have told you years ago, but I've been bound by a promise made by your great-grandfather. The map in my lockbox shows the location of what our family has protected since 1865. Your great-grandfather, William Hayes, didn't just return from the Civil War with wounds and memories. He brought something that changed our family's destiny, something that needed to be hidden. What lies beneath our east field isn't just a shelter, as the journal calls it. It's a repository. The entrance is 8 feet below ground, marked by the old stake fence I've maintained all these years. The combination to the door is the day, month, and year of your birth. This legacy is now yours to protect or reveal as you see fit. Trust no one outside the family until you understand what you've found. With love and faith in your judgment, Dad." Jackson read the letter twice, then passed it to Emma, whose historian's eyes widened as she absorbed its implications. "Repository could mean anything," she said cautiously. "But combined with this map and the repeated references to a shelter in the journals, we could be looking at some kind of historical cache." "Or my father's wild goose chase," Jackson suggested, trying to temper expectations. Yet something in his father's final message carried a gravity that couldn't be dismissed. Robert Hayes had been many things: a veteran, a farmer, occasionally stubborn, but never fanciful or prone to exaggeration. As the evening deepened into night, they pored over the old map, comparing it to modern surveys of the property. The precision of the markings, despite the age of the document, suggested careful measurement rather than approximation. What had initially seemed like random notations began to reveal a pattern, a series of tunnels or chambers extending beneath what was now the eastern cornfield. "This level of detail," Emma whispered, "this isn't something your great-grandfather imagined. He surveyed and documented whatever's down there with engineer-like precision." By lamplight, Jackson discovered another document tucked within the journal's binding. A faded letter dated 1865, written to William Hayes by someone identified only as Colonel T. The fragile paper contained references to treasury transport, appropriate concealment, and service to nation above recognition. Most intriguing was the final line: "History will not record your contribution, but your descendants will know the truth when the time is right." Jackson sat back, trying to process this revelation. His great-grandfather, the Civil War veteran whose portrait hung in the farmhouse dining room, whose simple farming legacy had been the foundation of family stories for generations, had apparently been involved in something far more complex than agricultural pioneering. "You realize what this might mean," Emma said slowly, her historian's mind connecting dots across centuries. Late April 1865, the war ending, Lincoln assassinated, the Confederate government fleeing south with whatever resources they could salvage. "You think this has something to do with Civil War treasure?" Jackson asked, skepticism warring, with the mounting evidence before them. "I think," Emma replied carefully, "that your family farm might be sitting on a historical mystery that's remained hidden for over 150 years. As midnight approached, the weight of his father's final request settled on Jackson's shoulders. Whatever lay beneath the eastern field had been important enough for 4 generations of Hayes men to protect in silence. Now, with the farm's future hanging in the balance and his father's last wish written plainly before him, Jackson knew he would need to uncover the truth. "Tomorrow," he decided, looking at Emma across the table scattered with fragments of his family's hidden history. "Tomorrow, we see what's under that field." Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams filled with images of his ancestors, the stern-faced William returning from war, his grandfather working the fields during the Depression, his father maintaining vigilant watch over a secret he'd carried to his grave. Jackson woke before dawn, the first grey light barely penetrating the bedroom curtains, with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before his father's illness. As he moved through the quiet house, he found Emma already awake, making coffee in the kitchen, her laptop open to historical archives about post-Civil War Illinois. "I've been researching all night," she admitted, sliding a cup toward him. "There are accounts of missing Confederate Treasury shipments during the final days of the war. Most historians believe they were captured by Union forces or dispersed by fleeing officials, but there are significant amounts that were never accounted for." She paused, meeting his eyes. "And several Union regiments from this county were involved in Treasury security during those final weeks." The connection to his great-grandfather's service became clearer. William Hayes had served in the 104th Illinois Infantry, returning home in summer 1865 with enough money to purchase the original 80 acres that would become their farm. Family. Law had always attributed this to savings from his military pay and a small inheritance, but now Jackson wondered if there was more to the story. By mid-morning they had assembled the necessary equipment: shovels, an old metal detector from his father's collection, work lights, and the farm's compact excavator. Their 17-year-old son, Michael, home for summer break from his first year at agricultural college, watched the preparations with growing curiosity. "What's going on?" he asked, eyeing the unusual collection of tools loaded into the truck bed. "Since when do we dig in the East Field? Dad always said you were skittish about disturbing those rocks." Jackson hesitated, unsure how much to share about a mystery he barely understood himself. "Your grandfather left something for us to find," he finally explained, keeping to simplest truth. "A family matter that needs taking care of." Emma added nothing, but her meaningful glance told Jackson they would need to decide how to involve their son in whatever they discovered. The Hayes family secret, whatever it was, would eventually become Michael's responsibility as well. The morning sun cast long shadows across the East Field as Jackson, Emma, and Michael made their way toward the location marked on the century-old map. The rocky terrain was punctuated by tall corn stalks that had somehow managed to thrive despite the challenging soil. Jackson carried the metal detector while Emma consulted the map, carefully matching landmarks that had survived generations of farming. "This should be it," she said, stopping near a weathered stake fence that had always seemed oddly placed. "According to the map, we're standing directly above whatever your great-grandfather marked." Jackson nodded, surveying the area with new eyes. What had always appeared to be a random collection of large rocks and poor soil now revealed itself as possibly deliberate, a natural-looking camouflage maintained for over 150 years. "Dad always insisted we leave this section alone," he recalled, running his hand along one of the stake fence posts. "Every time I suggested clearing these rocks to expand the planting area, he'd find some reason why it wasn't worth the effort." Michael, still puzzled by the morning's mysterious project, examined the aging fence posts with growing interest. "These are set deeper than normal," he observed, the agricultural engineering student in him noticing what others might miss. "And the spacing is too precise for a typical boundary marker." Jackson began sweeping the area with the metal detector, its electronic whine cutting through the morning stillness. Within minutes, the device erupted in a sustained tone that indicated significant metal mass beneath the surface. "Found something," he announced, marking the spot with a surveyor's flag. Continuing the sweep revealed an underground formation approximately 12 feet square, far too regular to be natural and far too large to be casual farming debris. "Whatever's down there, it's substantial," Emma noted, recording the dimensions in her notebook, "and deliberately hidden." With the target area identified, Jackson brought forward the compact excavator. The machine's hydraulics hummed as he carefully began removing the topsoil layer by layer. Michael joined the effort with a shovel, clearing smaller areas that the machine couldn't reach with precision. "We need to be careful," Jackson cautioned. "If this is what I think it is, we don't want to damage the entrance." 3 feet down, they struck the first artificial layer, flat stones arranged in an interlocking pattern, mortared together with a substance that had hardened to near-concrete strength over the decades. "This is 19th century craftsmanship," Emma remarked, examining the stonework. "Your great-grandfather brought in skilled masons for this. These aren't just random rocks. They're cut and placed to distribute weight." Working methodically, they removed the stone layer to reveal what lay beneath, a bed of clay and gravel that seemed designed to absorb moisture and prevent erosion from reaching deeper levels. Jackson found himself increasingly impressed by the engineering foresight his ancestor had employed, creating a protective system that had weathered 150 years of seasonal changes without failure. By mid-afternoon, with the sun high overhead and sweat soaking through their clothes, they reached a depth of nearly 8 feet. Michael was the first to spot it, a glint of metal exposed by his shovel's latest cut through the dense subsoil. "Dad!" he called out. "There's something metal down here." Jackson halted the excavator immediately, joining his son at the edge of the deepening pit. Carefully brushing away soil with gloved hands, they gradually revealed what appeared to be a rusted metal door set at an angle into the ground. Heavy hinges lined one side, while the opposite edge featured an ancient but robust-looking locking. "Mechanism, it's real," Emma whispered, her historian's skepticism giving way to wonder. "Your father wasn't delusional or confused. There actually is something buried here." The door, approximately 4 feet wide by 6 feet tall, bore no markings or identifying features beyond a simple metal plate where a keyhole might normally be. Instead of a traditional lock, the plate covered what appeared to be a combination, in dial, primitive by modern standards, but sophisticated for Civil War-era security. "Remember what Dad's letter said?" Jackson murmured, kneeling before the ancient mechanism. "The combination is my birth date." Brushing decades of soil from the dial, he carefully entered the numbers, 1105-84. The mechanism, remarkably preserved beneath layers of protective covering, responded with a series of clicks that culminated in a definitive clunk as internal. "Tumblers aligned." "It worked," Jackson said, disbelief coloring his voice. "After all this time, it actually worked." The three of them exchanged glances, the weight of the moment palpable. Whatever lay beyond that door had been concealed and protected by 4 generations of Hayes men, a secret deemed important enough to maintain even in death. "Should we open it now?" Michael asked, the excitement of discovery evident in his voice. Before Jackson could respond, Emma's phone rang, the distinctive tone she'd assigned to the local historical society where she volunteered. She answered, with obvious reluctance, her eyes never leaving the uncovered door. "Yes, this is Emma Hayes," she confirmed, then listened intently. "Today, but we're in the middle of—" Her expression shifted to one of concern. "How many vehicles? And they asked for us specifically?" She ended the call, turning to Jackson with a troubled look. "That was Diane from the society. There's a group of people in town asking about the Hayes farm, a government historian, and what looks like security personnel. They mentioned something about recovering cultural assets, and they're heading this way." Jackson's mind raced back to his father's final warning. "Trust no one outside the family until you understand what you found." The timing seemed too coincidental to be chance. "Cover it back up," he decided quickly. "Just enough to hide it from casual observation. We need to know what we're dealing with before anyone official gets involved." Working rapidly, they pushed soil back over the exposed door, leaving just enough clear to access it again, then scattered the excavation equipment to make the site look like routine farm work rather than a targeted dig. They had barely finished when the distinct sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention to the main farm road. 2 black SUVs and a government-plated sedan made their way toward the farmhouse, dust billowing behind them. "Get back to the house," Jackson instructed. "Act normal. If they ask, we're just clearing rocks to expand the planting area." As they drove the pickup back toward the main buildings, Michael voiced what they were all thinking. "How did they know? Grandpa just died, we just found the map, and suddenly government people show up?" It was a question with troubling implications. Either Robert Hayes had not been the only one aware of the secret beneath their field, or someone had been monitoring them more closely than they realized. They reached the farmhouse just as the vehicles pulled into the circular drive. A trim, silver-haired woman in a navy pantsuit emerged from the lead SUV, flanked by 2 younger men whose posture and alertness suggested security training rather than academic backgrounds. From the sedan stepped an older man, professorial in appearance, carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Hayes," the woman called as Jackson approached. "I'm Director Catherine Blackwood with the Historical Assets Recovery Division. We need to discuss a matter of some historical significance regarding your property." Jackson's surprise at being known by name must have shown on his face, because the woman's expression softened marginally. "Your family's land has been of interest to our department for quite some time," she explained, glancing toward the eastern field they'd just left, "though we didn't anticipate having this conversation quite so soon after your father's passing." What department would that be exactly? Emma asked, her academic background making her immediately skeptical of vague authority claims. Director Blackwood reached into her jacket and produced credentials that she held out briefly, too briefly to examine in detail, but long enough to convey official authorization. "We're a specialized division within the Treasury Department," she replied, "focused on recovering historical assets of significant national value. I believe your great-grandfather, William Hayes, would have been familiar with our predecessor organization." The confirmation that this was indeed connected to William's Civil War service sent a chill through Jackson despite the summer heat. "What brings Treasury agents to a struggling corn farm?" he asked, deliberately casual, giving no indication of their morning's discovery. "Historical records suggest that your ancestor may have been involved in securing certain government assets during a chaotic period at the war's end," the older man interjected, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "Dr. Martin Ellison, Treasury historian. The documentation we've uncovered indicates that Captain William Hayes may have been entrusted with materials that technically remain federal property." Jackson shook the offered hand automatically, his mind racing. The mention of his great-grandfather's exact military rank suggested their research was substantive rather than speculative. "My great-grandfather's been dead for a century," he replied carefully, "and this farm's been in continuous operation since 1865. If there were government materials here, someone would have found them by now." Director Blackwood's expression revealed nothing, but her gaze sharpened at his deliberate obtuseness. "Mr. Hayes, we have reason to believe your father may have shared certain family information with you before his passing. Information pertaining to a repository established in 1865. The use of the specific term, repository, identical to Robert's letter, confirmed that these weren't random government officials on a fishing expedition. They knew, or strongly suspected, what lay beneath the eastern field. My father passed 3 weeks ago after a difficult illness," Jackson stated, allowing genuine grief to color his voice. "He barely had strength to discuss funeral arrangements, let alone historical mysteries." Emma stepped forward, her professional demeanor as an archivist creating a natural buffer. "As a historian myself, I'd be fascinated to hear what documentation you've discovered that connects this farm to Civil War assets. Perhaps we could review your research. Proper academic protocol would suggest sharing such information before making claims about private property." Her challenge, delivered with collegial politeness, caused Dr. Ellison to shift uncomfortably, glancing toward Director Blackwood for guidance. "Our documentation is classified," Blackwood responded smoothly, "but I'm authorized to inform you that we've identified this location as the likely storage site for approximately $30 million in gold and currency removed from Confederate Treasury holdings in April 1865. The figure, enormous even by modern standards, astronomical by Civil War-era valuation, hung in the air between them. Michael, who had been silently observing the exchange, failed to suppress a small sound of surprise. "That's quite a claim," Jackson remarked, fighting to maintain his composure. "And quite convenient timing, just after the owner of this property passes away." "We've been monitoring this situation for decades, Mr. Hayes," Blackwood countered. "Your father was approached during the 1980s but refused cooperation. We respected that decision while he was alive, but national historical interests must now take precedence. This new information, that his father had faced similar confrontation and had maintained the family secret despite official pressure, strengthened Jackson's resolve to understand what they were protecting before surrendering anything. "I'm afraid I can't help you," he said firmly. "If my father didn't share anything with government officials who approached him 40 years ago, he certainly didn't leave me any historical treasure maps on his deathbed." Director Blackwood studied him for a moment, then nodded to one of her companions who returned to the SUV and retrieved what appeared to be surveying equipment. "We have authorization to conduct a non-invasive survey of your property," she stated, producing a document bearing official seals. "This warrant permits ground-penetrating radar examination of specific areas identified in our historical analysis. We would prefer your cooperation, but it isn't strictly necessary." Jackson accepted the document, scanning its contents while calculating their options. The warrant appeared legitimate, authorizing surface scanning, but not excavation. A temporary, delaying tactic at best. If they detected the metal door, they would certainly return with expanded authorization. "You're welcome to scan all the cornfields you want," he conceded, with a farmer's practiced shrug. "But I have actual work to do running a farm. Emma can show your historian around if he's interested in the property's documented history." The implied division of their visitors, separating Blackwood's security team from the academic historian, was deliberate. Emma would keep Dr. Ellison occupied with the farm's legitimate historical features, while Jackson considered their next steps. As Blackwood's team unloaded their equipment, preparing to survey the eastern field they'd just hastily covered, Jackson exchanged a meaningful glance with Emma. Whatever window of opportunity they had to explore the repository before, government intervention was rapidly closing. "Michael," he said quietly to his son, "take the ATV around to check the irrigation lines on the west fields. Then get the generator and lights from the storage shed and leave them by the oak grove, just in case we need to work late tonight." The young man nodded, understanding the unspoken message. They would return to the door after dark, after their uninvited visitors had completed their initial survey and hopefully departed to analyze their findings. As Jackson watched the government team make their way toward the eastern field, he recalled his father's decades of silent vigilance, maintaining a secret that had now fallen to him. Whatever lay beyond that rusted door had been important enough for generations of Hayes men to protect it from official recovery. Before surrendering their family legacy to government seizure, he intended to discover exactly what they had been, guarding all these years. The afternoon stretched into early evening as Jackson maintained the facade of routine farm work while keeping a careful eye on Director Blackwood's team. Their ground-penetrating radar equipment moved methodically across the eastern field in a grid pattern, focusing particularly on the area surrounding their hastily covered excavation. Dr. Ellison followed Emma on what appeared to be an exhaustive historical tour of the property, his academic enthusiasm providing welcome distraction from the more tactical operations underway. As the summer sun began its descent toward the horizon, Jackson found himself in the barn, ostensibly performing equipment maintenance while actually gathering supplies they might need for a nighttime exploration. He was selecting battery-powered lights when Michael entered, his expression tense with urgency. "They found something," the young man reported quietly. "I overheard the technicians talking. Their radar picked up a significant anomaly right where we were digging. They're calling in what they described as a recovery assessment team scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning." Jackson nodded, processing this unwelcome but expected development. "Did they mention excavation equipment?" "Yeah," Michael confirmed. "Someone named Collins is bringing a specialized team with proper extraction protocols. They're planning a full operation starting at dawn." Their window of opportunity had narrowed from days to mere hours. Whatever exploration they intended would need to happen tonight, under cover of darkness, before federal agents arrived with equipment and authorization to seize whatever lay beyond that rusted door. By 7:30 p.m., Director Blackwood's team had completed their initial survey, packing their equipment with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to field operations. The director herself approached Jackson as he stood on the farmhouse porch, watching their preparations to depart. "We've completed our preliminary assessment, Mr. Hayes," she informed him, her tone professional, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction that confirmed Michael's report. We'll be returning tomorrow with specialized equipment to investigate certain geological anomalies. Geological anomalies on a farm? Sounds like you're looking for oil, not history, Jackson remarked, maintaining his facade of casual disinterest. Director. Blackwood studied him with calculating eyes. Mr. Hayes, I want to be transparent about our intentions. We have strong evidence of a significant historical cache beneath your property. When recovered, these assets will be properly documented, and your family will receive appropriate recognition for their role in preserving them. Recognition doesn't pay the mortgage, Jackson observed dryly. There may be consideration for a finder's fee, she conceded, though legally these assets remain federal property. I should also note that any attempt to access or remove materials before our official recovery would constitute federal theft. The warning was delivered casually, but with unmistakable intent. Jackson smiled thinly, giving nothing away. I'll keep that in mind if I stumble across any Civil War gold while checking irrigation lines tonight. As the government vehicles departed, down the dusty farm road, Emma joined Jackson on the porch, Dr. Ellison having finally exhausted his questions about the farm's documented history. They know, she said simply. Ellison was fishing for confirmation the entire tour. He has records of your great-grandfather's regiment being assigned to Treasury Security Detail during the final weeks of the war, and transaction documents showing he purchased this land with cash in June 1865. Did you learn anything useful from him? Jackson asked. Emma nodded. Quite a bit, actually. The official narrative is that approximately 30 million in gold and currency disappeared during the chaos following Lincoln's assassination. Confederate officials were attempting to transport their remaining treasury south, while Union forces were trying to secure it as federal property. Several shipments vanished completely, and they think it ended up under our cornfield. According to Ellison, they've eliminated other possibilities through decades of investigation. Your great-grandfather's sudden acquisition of prime farmland, combined with his Treasury security assignment and some recently declassified military communications, has convinced them this is the location. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of historical intrigue far beyond the simple farming legacy he'd always believed defined his family. Yet questions remained. Most significantly, why had 4 generations of Hayes men protected this secret rather than claiming such wealth for themselves? As darkness enveloped the farm, Jackson, Emma, and Michael gathered in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones despite the departure of their unwelcome visitors. We have about 10 hours before they return, Jackson calculated. That's our window to discover exactly what we're dealing with. And if it is Confederate gold, Michael asked, the question they'd all been considering. Do we have any legal claim to it? Emma's historical expertise provided some context. Legally complicated. Confederate assets technically became federal property after the surrender, but there are precedents for treasure trove laws applying to long-hidden caches, particularly on private property, maintained by the same family for generations. I'm less concerned with legal ownership right now than understanding why my ancestors kept this hidden for so long, Jackson replied. They could have used that wealth during the Depression, could have saved dozens of neighboring farms. Instead, 4 generations maintained the secret, even at great personal cost. The question hung between them as they finalized their preparations. By 9:30 p.m., with full darkness providing cover, they loaded the equipment Michael had staged earlier onto the farm's utility vehicle, generator, lights, basic tools, and a digital camera to document whatever they discovered. The night air carried the sweet scent of corn as they made their silent journey toward the eastern field. Headlights, off navigating by moonlight and familiarity. The excavation site appeared undisturbed, the hastily replaced soil a darker patch against the surrounding ground. Working quickly, they cleared away the covering soil, revealing once more the rusted metal door with its combination lock. Jackson knelt before it, entered his birth date as before, and felt the satisfying mechanical shift as the tumblers aligned. This time they were prepared to go further. The ancient hinges protested with a groan, like distant thunder as they pulled. The heavy door opened, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. The air that rushed upward carried a musty yet oddly clean scent, free from the decay one might expect after over a century sealed underground. "The engineering is remarkable," Emma observed, examining the entrance. "This isn't just a hole in the ground. It's a carefully designed access point with proper ventilation systems." Jackson switched on the most powerful flashlight, directing its beam down the staircase. The steps, carved from stone and reinforced with metal edging, descended at a sharp angle before disappearing into darkness beyond the light's reach. "I'll go first," he decided, placing a foot on the top step. "Michael, stay up here with the equipment until we confirm it's stable." The descent felt like traveling backward through time, each step taking them deeper into his family's secret history. The staircase extended approximately 20 feet underground before opening into a small antechamber carved from the bedrock and reinforced with brick and timber supports. Despite its age, the structure showed no signs of collapse or water damage, a testament to William Hayes' engineering foresight. "The preservation is incredible," Emma whispered, her historian's training evident in her reverent tone. "These support techniques are classic Civil War-era military engineering. Your great-grandfather had professional help designing this." The antechamber contained a simple wooden table and what appeared to be an ancient oil lamp, its glass clouded. With age, on the table lay a leather-bound journal similar to the one they'd discovered in Robert's lockbox, but significantly older and more weathered. "Another journal," Jackson said, carefully opening the fragile cover to reveal handwriting, distinctly different from his father's, presumably William Hayes's own account. The first page bore a simple heading, "Accounting of Assets and Trust, established May 1865. Before Jackson could read further, Emma's attention was drawn to a much more substantial feature, a heavy wooden door on the chamber's far wall, reinforced with iron bands and secured with another combination lock. 2 layers of security, she noted. Whatever's beyond that door was meant to stay extremely private. Jackson examined the second lock, this one more elaborate than the entrance mechanism. Unlike the first, this lock featured letters rather than numbers, a word-based combination, rather than a date. "Any ideas?" he asked, staring at the unfamiliar mechanism. Emma joined him, examining the lock carefully. "It's a letter tumbler system, 6 positions. We need a 6-letter word that your ancestors would have chosen, something meaningful but not obvious." "Try family," Michael suggested, having joined them after securing the outer entrance. The attempt failed, the tumblers refusing to align. They tried several alternatives, William, United, Nation, and other period-appropriate terms, without success. "Wait," Jackson said suddenly, picking up the journal again and examining the first page more carefully. There, partially, obscured by age, was a phrase underlined in the introduction, "For liberty and honor above all else." "Liberty," he said, turning to the lock and aligning the tumblers to match the 6-letter word. The mechanism responded with a series of clicks, culminating in a satisfying clunk as the internal bolts retracted. The second door swung open more smoothly than the first, revealing what lay beyond, and the sight left them momentarily speechless. The sheer chamber beyond was substantial, at least 30 feet square, with a high ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Ventilation shafts, cleverly disguised above ground as old fence posts, provided a constant circulation of fresh air. The space was illuminated by their flashlight beams, revealing row upon row of wooden crates, metal strongboxes, and canvas. Bags stacked in meticulous order, My God, Emma breathed, playing her light across the chamber. This isn't just some small cache. This is an entire treasury vault. The organization was military in its precision. Each section was marked with stenciled labels indicating contents: gold eagles, silver dollars, treasury notes, and other designations consistent with Civil War-era currency. Along one wall stood larger crates marked Confederate bonds and bank drafts, while another section contained what appeared to be ledgers and document boxes. "This explains the government's interest," Michael observed, examining the nearest container without touching it. "There must be millions here, even by 1865 valuation. But why hide Union currency and Confederate holdings together? Why not turn over the Confederate assets after the war?" Jackson had moved to a small desk positioned near the center of the room, where a leather portfolio lay open, preserved in the controlled environment of the underground chamber. Inside was a letter written in the same hand as the journal, but with greater formality, clearly intended as an official explanation for whoever eventually discovered the repository. "Listen to this," he said, reading from the aged document. "To my descendants who discover this repository, what you have found is not simply Confederate gold, seized during my service, but a complex collection of assets from both sides of our tragic conflict. In April 1865, as our divided nation reeled from President Lincoln's assassination and the war's chaotic conclusion, I was tasked with securing a treasury shipment being transported north from Richmond. What was not recorded in official dispatches was that this shipment contained not only Confederate reserves being seized as spoils of war, but also Union assets that had been recovered from multiple locations, funds appropriated for reconstruction, currency intended for military pay, and gold that represented our fragile nation's attempt to re-establish financial stability. During transport to Washington, our convoy was attacked by deserters from both armies who had formed opportunistic bands in the war's aftermath. In the chaos that followed, I made the decision to conceal these assets rather than risk their theft. Only 3 men in my unit survived the attack, and together we established this repository with the intention of reporting its location once stability returned. The shooting of my compatriots in a Washington boarding house 3 weeks later, deaths officially attributed to a dispute over cards, but which I believe were assassinations by those who had orchestrated the attack on our convoy, convinced me that powerful interests were determined to acquire these funds outside official channels. I chose preservation over personal gain, rather than risk these assets falling into corrupt hands during the chaotic Reconstruction period. I have maintained this repository in secret, establishing this farm as its permanent guardian. I leave it to future generations of my bloodline to determine when our nation has achieved the stability and integrity necessary for these funds to serve their intended purpose: the true reconstruction and unification of our divided states. Until that time, maintain this trust as I have. The security of these assets represents a sacred duty to a nation that may not yet be worthy of their return. Captain William Hayes, 104th Illinois Infantry, May 12, 1865. The letter cast the repository in an entirely new light. This wasn't simply Confederate gold hidden by an opportunistic soldier, but a principled protection of combined Union and Confederate assets against corruption during Reconstruction. A trust maintained through generations awaiting the proper time for restoration. "Your great-grandfather wasn't a thief," Emma said softly. "He was a whistleblower before the term existed. He protected these assets from corruption during one of America's most vulnerable periods. And every Hayes man since has honored that protection," Jackson added, understanding now why his father and grandfather had maintained the secret despite financial hardships that could have been easily solved by the wealth beneath their fields. Michael had moved deeper into the chamber. his flashlight illuminating objects beyond the currency containers. "Dad, Emma, there's more here than just money," he called. "These crates contain historical documents, letters, official papers, some signed by Lincoln himself." Emma rushed to examine his discovery, her historian's training immediately recognizing the significance. "These are presidential papers that historians believed were destroyed during the fall of Richmond, primary sources that could transform our understanding of Lincoln's final plans for Reconstruction." As they continued exploring the vast chamber, the true scope of William Hayes' repository became clear. Beyond the immense financial wealth, he had preserved historical documents of incalculable value to the nation's understanding of its most divisive period. Documents that had remained hidden from both public knowledge and potential destruction for over a century and a half. Jackson found himself at a moral crossroads far more complex than a simple question of legal ownership. His ancestors had maintained this remarkable trust through generations, preserving not just wealth but historical truth during periods when either might have been misused or suppressed. Now, with government agents set to descend on their farm, at dawn he faced the same essential question that had confronted each Hayes man before him. What was the right thing to do with this extraordinary legacy? For several minutes, Jackson, Emma, and Michael moved through the underground chamber in awe-struck silence, their flashlight beams illuminating sections of the vast repository. The calculated value of the financial assets alone was staggering. In their gold coins in denominations largely unseen in modern currency, silver bullion stacked in neat rows, and currency notes from both Union and Confederate sources preserved in airtight containers. But it was the historical documents that truly captured Emma's professional attention. "These papers," she whispered, carefully examining a leather portfolio without touching its contents directly. "They're not just financially valuable as artifacts. They represent missing pieces of American history." Jackson joined her, directing his light over what appeared to be official dispatches and personal correspondence, with presidential seals and signatures. "Lincoln's final directives on Reconstruction," Emma identified, reading the visible headers. "Communications with generals and cabinet members in the weeks before his assassination. These documents would fundamentally change our understanding of his intentions for healing the nation after the war." Michael had moved to another section of the chamber, where he discovered something unexpected. Journals similar to William Hayes's official account, but written by the other survivors mentioned in the letter. "Dad, there are first-hand accounts here from the men who helped great-great-grandfather establish this place," he called out. "Detailed descriptions of the attack on their convoy, suspicions about who might have orchestrated it, even names of officials they believed were compromised." The implications were profound. What they had uncovered wasn't simply a fortune in gold and silver, but potentially explosive evidence of high-level corruption during the Reconstruction era. Corruption that had apparently justified generations of secrecy. "No wonder the government is so determined to recover this," Jackson said, "the pieces finally coming together. It's not just about the money. These documents could rewrite a significant chapter of American history." Emma nodded, her historian's training allowing her to grasp the full significance, and potentially embarrass some very old and influential families whose ancestors are implicated in these papers. Even after 150 years, there are reputations and legacies that could be damaged by these revelations. The weight of their discovery settled over them. Beyond the immediate question of the asset's enormous value lay a more profound responsibility, the historical truth preserved by William Hayes and protected by his descendants through generations of careful stewardship. "We need to document everything before they arrive tomorrow," Emma decided, her professional instincts taking over. Photographs, inventory lists, transcriptions of key documents. "If the government seizes this repository, we need independent evidence of exactly what it contains," Jackson agreed, recognizing the wisdom in her approach. "Michael, bring down the camera," and the rest of the lights. We have hours of work ahead of us. As Michael ascended the stairs to retrieve their equipment, Jackson found himself drawn to a small wooden chest, positioned prominently on the central desk, separate from the main collection and apparently intended to be noticed by whoever discovered the chamber. Unlike the other containers, this one had no lock, only a simple brass latch. Inside, he found personal items belonging to William Hayes, a pocket watch, military insignia from his service, in the 104th Illinois, and a sealed letter addressed simply "To my blood when the time comes." With careful fingers, Jackson broke the wax seal that had remained intact for over a century and unfolded the brittle paper within. The handwriting matched the official explanation, but the tone was more intimate. A personal message, rather, than a historical accounting. My dear descendant, if you are reading this, you have discovered the burden I have passed through our line. I do not know how many generations will guard this secret before the right time comes for its revelation, but I trust the judgment of my blood. What lies before you presents both opportunity and danger. The wealth contained herein could secure your family's prosperity for generations, but at the cost of the greater purpose for which it has been preserved. The documents that accompany these treasures contain truths that powerful interests have sought to suppress, evidence of corruption that reaches the highest levels of our reunified government. I made my choice knowing the personal cost. When I purchased this land, instead of returning to my former home in Springfield, I did so to establish a permanent guardian for these assets. I have lived modestly while sitting atop a fortune that could have made me one of the wealthiest men in Illinois, because I believed that personal sacrifice was warranted by the greater good of preserving both these resources and truths until our nation healed sufficiently to face them. Each generation of our family will face this same choice. You may judge that your time is right for revelation, or you may determine, as I have, that the moment has not yet arrived. I place no obligation upon you except this: act with honor, consider consequences beyond yourself, and remember that some truths are worth protecting even at great personal cost. The combination to the inner chamber will open only to the word that has guided my actions through war and peace. May it guide yours as well. Your ancestor, William Hayes, Captain, 104th Illinois Infantry. The personal message deepened Jackson's understanding of the moral complexity his ancestors had navigated. William Hayes hadn't simply hidden assets from corruption. He had deliberately established a generational trust, accepting personal sacrifice for what he perceived as a greater good. As Jackson absorbed the implications of his ancestors' words, Michael returned with additional equipment. Together, the family began the meticulous process of documenting the chamber's contents, photographing each section, creating inventory lists of the financial holdings, and carefully recording the existence and general content of the historical documents without disturbing their fragile condition. Emma, her historian's training proving invaluable, organized their documentation by potential significance, focusing particularly on the papers that might have the greatest historical impact, if properly preserved and studied. The presidential documents alone would warrant dedicated academic study for years, she observed, cataloging a section of official dispatches. These last communications from Lincoln's administration represent a historical treasure beyond calculation. As the night deepened, the documentation grew more comprehensive. The repository's contents proved even more extensive than initially apparent, with sections dedicated to military maps, intelligence reports, and what appeared to be encoded communications between government officials during the chaotic period following Lincoln's assassination. By 2 a.m., their systematic inventory had revealed the true scope of William Hayes's preservation efforts. Beyond the approximately $30 million in gold and silver by 1865 valuation, potentially hundreds of millions by modern standards, the repository contained historical documentation that represented an incalculable contribution to understanding one of America's most pivotal and poorly documented transitions of power. Taking a break from their documentation efforts, the family gathered around the central desk to consider their options before morning brought government intervention. "We need to decide what to do," Jackson said, voicing the question they'd all been considering. "Once Blackwood's team arrives, we lose control of this entire situation." Michael, the youngest yet perhaps most pragmatic, offered the first concrete suggestion. "We could relocate some of it. Not the gold or anything obviously missing, but key documents, things we could study and potentially release when we understand their full significance." Emma shook her head reluctantly. "Removing anything creates legal jeopardy. If they've already identified this site through ground-penetrating radar, they'll have baseline expectations of what should be here. Missing items would trigger a criminal investigation." "There's another approach," Jackson said slowly. "An idea, forming as he considered William Hayes' words about acting with honor and considering consequences beyond themselves. What if we control the narrative rather than the physical assets?" His wife and son looked at him questioningly. "We've documented everything," he continued, developing the concept. "We have photographic evidence, inventory lists, even images of key historical documents. What if, instead of trying to hide anything, we go public before they can establish their preferred narrative?" Emma caught his thinking immediately. "Create transparency that forces proper handling and acknowledgement. If the public knows these historical documents exist before they're seized, it becomes much harder to suppress or selectively release them." "Exactly," Jackson confirmed. "We contact trusted media outlets, academic institutions, and historical societies simultaneously. Share our documentation with multiple sources before Blackwood's team arrives, establishing independent knowledge of exactly what this repository contains." "That still doesn't address the financial assets," Michael pointed out. "Even if we ensure the historical documents are properly acknowledged, what about the gold and currency? That's what could save the farm." Jackson considered his son's practical concern. 4 generations of Hayes men had protected this repository through financial hardship, maintaining the trust despite personal cost. Yet William's letter had acknowledged that each generation would face its own choice about when revelation might be appropriate. "Your great-grandfather's letter mentioned acting with honor and considering consequences beyond ourselves," he said thoughtfully. "I think that means doing what's right, not necessarily what's easy or personally beneficial." He reached a decision, feeling the weight of generations in the moment. "We make a public claim for a finder's fee or recovery percentage, something reasonable that acknowledges the government's technical ownership while recognizing our family's 150-year stewardship. But more importantly, we establish independent oversight of the historical documents to ensure they're properly preserved, studied, and made available to researchers without political filtering." Emma nodded, seeing the wisdom in this balanced approach. "We're not seeking to profit excessively, just to secure the farm's future while ensuring historical transparency." That seems consistent with William's principles. With their strategy taking shape, they returned to their documentation with renewed purpose, focusing particularly on creating backup copies of their inventory that could be distributed to multiple sources before morning. Emma used her professional connections to draft a list of reputable historians, academic institutions, and historical societies that could serve as independent verification of their discovery. By 4:30 a.m., with the first hints of dawn lightening the eastern sky, they had completed their documentation and returned to the farmhouse. While Michael backed up their photographs and inventory lists to multiple devices, Emma began composing emails to her most trusted academic contacts, preparing information packets that could be sent simultaneously when they were ready to go public. Jackson, meanwhile, drafted a formal statement explaining their discovery, their understanding of its historical significance, and their request for proper handling of both the financial assets and historical documentation. He emphasized their family's long stewardship and their desire for transparency rather than personal enrichment. As the farm began to brighten with morning light, they gathered in the kitchen, exhausted but resolved. Within hours, Director Blackwood's team would return with equipment and authorization to seize the repository's contents. Their window for independent action was closing rapidly. "Are we ready for this?" Jackson asked, looking at his wife and son. "Once we send these communications, there's no turning back. We'll be challenging the government's preferred handling of a historically significant discovery." Emma reached across the table, taking his hand. "Your ancestors kept this secret for generations because they didn't believe the right time had come for revelation. Maybe this is the moment William Hayes was waiting for, when his descendants would recognize that the truth should finally be preserved through transparency rather than secrecy." Michael nodded in agreement, the youngest Hayes now part of a legacy he'd only just discovered. Great-great-grandfather's letter said to act with honor and consider consequences beyond ourselves. Making sure these historical truths are properly acknowledged seems like the honorable choice. With their consensus reached, Jackson made the final decision. "Send the emails. Contact the media outlets on our list. We go public before Blackwood's. A team arrives." Emma began the distribution of their carefully prepared information packets, sending simultaneous communications to selected historians, universities, and historical preservation societies across the country. Michael, leveraging the social media skills of his generation, prepared more immediate notifications to trusted journalists and news organizations, including photographs sufficiently detailed to establish credibility without revealing security-sensitive aspects of the repository's location. Jackson watched the family's coordinated efforts with a mixture of pride and apprehension. After generations of carefully guarded secrecy, the Hayes family was deliberately bringing their extraordinary legacy into the light. Whether this decision would save their farm or create new complications remained to be seen, but the moral clarity of ensuring historical transparency provided a certain peace amidst the uncertainty. By 7:00 a.m., they had distributed their documentation to over 20 independent sources, enough to ensure that whatever happened when Director Blackwood's team arrived, the full contents of William Hayes's remarkable repository would not remain solely in government hands. As if summoned by their completed preparations, the distinctive sound of vehicles approaching down the farm road signaled the return of the Historical Assets Recovery Division. Through the kitchen window, Jackson could see the same black SUVs from yesterday, now accompanied by larger vehicles that presumably contained excavation and recovery equipment. "Right on schedule," he remarked, gathering the final printouts of their inventory and securing them in a folder. "Let's meet them at the repository entrance. I want them to know immediately that we've documented everything." Together, the Hayes family walked out to the eastern field, where the open entrance to the underground chamber stood as testimony to their night's exploration. They positioned themselves by the entrance, presentation materials in hand, ready to establish their transparency-focused approach before Director Blackwood could implement whatever containment protocols the government had planned. As Blackwood emerged from the lead vehicle, her expression shifted from confident authority to cautious reassessment upon seeing the family already waiting at the obviously accessed repository. "Good morning, Director," Jackson called out, his voice carrying across the morning quiet farm. "We have some matters to discuss before your recovery operation begins." Director Blackwood halted several paces from the repository entrance, her team fanning out behind her with practiced precision. Her gaze swept over the open access point, the Hayes family's clearly exhausted but determined expressions, and the documentation materials they held. Her composed demeanor faltered momentarily before professional training reasserted itself. "I see you've been busy overnight, Mr. Hayes," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. "I should remind you that tampering with potential federal assets carries serious legal consequences." Jackson stepped forward, maintaining a respectful but firm stance. "Nothing has been tampered with, Director. We've simply exercised our right as property owners to investigate what lies beneath our own land. Everything remains exactly as it was found, thoroughly documented, and ready for proper historical preservation." He handed her a printed inventory, one of many copies they had prepared. "This is a complete catalogue of the repository's contents. Identical documentation has already been provided to several historical institutions and media outlets this morning." The strategic revelation caused a ripple of reactions among Blackwood's team. Dr. Ellison, emerging from one of the secondary vehicles, moved forward with barely contained academic excitement. "You've been inside. You've seen the actual documents." He directed his questions to Emma, recognizing a fellow historian. "Are the Lincoln papers truly preserved, the final reconstruction directives?" Before Emma could respond, Blackwood raised a hand to silence her colleague. "Dr. Ellison, contain your enthusiasm until we've established the legal parameters of this situation." Turning back to Jackson, her expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Hayes, disseminating information about classified historical assets without authorization could complicate your family's position considerably." "Perhaps," Jackson acknowledged calmly, "but ensuring historical transparency seemed the most responsible choice given the circumstances. My great-grandfather protected these assets for a reason, and 4 generations of my family have maintained that protection at considerable personal sacrifice." He gestured toward the open repository entrance. "We're not opposing recovery of these materials. We're simply ensuring their complete contents are properly acknowledged and preserved." Michael stepped forward, holding a digital tablet displaying selected photographs from their night's documentation. "We've identified at least 40 distinct document collections of major historical significance beyond the financial assets your team was primarily seeking." Dr. Ellison could not restrain himself, moving closer to examine the tablet despite Blackwood's evident displeasure. "Good God!" he exclaimed, his academic training overriding departmental protocol. "That's Lincoln's handwriting on that dispatch. And that seal! These are authentic cabinet-level communications from April 1865. "Precisely," Emma confirmed, engaging directly with the historian while Blackwood conferred urgently with her security team. "Including what appear to be his final directives on Reconstruction policy, documents historians have believed lost for over a century and a half." The professional connection between the two academics created a dynamic that Blackwood's security-focused approach couldn't easily control. Dr. Ellison's scholarly integrity was visibly competing with his departmental loyalty as he recognized the historical significance of what the Hayes family had discovered. "Director," Jackson said, redirecting the conversation to the person with actual authority, "we understand the government's technical claim to these assets. We're not contesting that, but we are requesting 3 specific considerations in light of our family's long stewardship." Blackwood's expression remained guarded, but she nodded slightly, indicating he should continue. "First," Jackson stated clearly, "independent academic oversight of the historical documentation to ensure proper preservation and unfiltered access for qualified researchers. Second, a reasonable finder's fee reflecting our family's role in preserving these assets, not the full value, just appropriate compensation that would allow us to maintain the farm that has served as guardian of this repository for generations. And finally, public acknowledgement of William Hayes's service and the honorable intentions behind his actions. My ancestor wasn't a thief. He was protecting these assets from corruption during one of our nation's most vulnerable periods. For several long moments, Director Blackwood said nothing, her calculating gaze shifting between the Hayes family, the open repository, and her increasingly interested historian colleague. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted from authority to pragmatic negotiation. Your public distribution of information has certainly adjusted the parameters of our recovery operation. Her carefully chosen words acknowledged the changed reality without admitting any weakness in the government's position. Dr. Ellison, please conduct a preliminary assessment of the repository's contents, focusing particularly on the historical documentation Mr. Hayes has highlighted. As the historian eagerly descended into the underground chamber with two technical specialists, Blackwood turned back to Jackson. Your approach is unorthodox, Mr. Hayes, but not entirely unreasonable. Given the circumstances, I'm authorized to discuss finder's fee arrangements within certain guidelines, though final determinations would require Treasury Department approval. And the independent academic oversight? Emma pressed, unwilling to let the historical preservation aspect be sidelined. That would normally be beyond my authority to promise, Blackwood admitted. However, the public awareness you've now created makes standard containment protocols impractical. Jackson recognized the professional acknowledgement of their strategic move. By distributing documentation before the government could establish complete control, they had effectively forced a more transparent approach to the repository's contents. Perhaps we can discuss specific arrangements while Dr. Ellison completes his initial assessment, Jackson suggested, indicating the farmhouse. I suspect we all could use some coffee after a long night. The negotiation that followed in the Hayes kitchen represented a delicate balance of competing interests. The government's desire to maintain control of valuable assets, the Hayes family's determination to ensure proper recognition and preservation, and the unexpected leverage created by their preemptive transparency. Dr. Ellison's breathless return from the repository an hour into their discussions shifted the dynamic decidedly in the family's favor. The historian's professional excitement could not be contained as he burst into the kitchen, forgetting protocols and hierarchies in his academic enthusiasm. Director, it's beyond our highest expectations, he reported, oblivious to having interrupted delicate negotiations. The documents alone represent the most significant Civil War discovery of the century. There are communications we believed destroyed in the fall of Richmond, presidential directives that reshape our understanding of Lincoln's final intentions for Reconstruction, and evidence of— He stopped abruptly, suddenly aware of overstepping. Evidence of what, Dr. Ellison? Blackwood prompted, her training allowing her to recognize when crucial information was being withheld. The historian glanced uncomfortably at the Hayes family before continuing more carefully. Evidence suggesting certain prominent figures in the post-war government may have been involved in activities that would warrant historical reassessment. The euphemistic phrasing confirmed what the Hayes family had already discovered. William Hayes had preserved not just financial assets, but documentation of corruption that had influenced his decision to maintain secrecy, rather than return the repository to government hands. Names that would still be recognized today? Blackwood asked sharply. Surnames that remain prominent in business and politics? Yes, Ellison confirmed reluctantly, which creates certain sensitivities regarding public access without proper context and verification. Jackson exchanged glances with Emma, recognizing the leverage this revelation provided. Historical documents implicating ancestors of still powerful families represented exactly the kind of information that might otherwise be quietly suppressed. Precisely what their transparency strategy had been designed to prevent. It seems my great-grandfather's concerns about ensuring these materials reached the right hands at the right time were well-founded, Jackson observed quietly, which makes independent academic oversight even more essential. Director Blackwood, a career professional who had navigated complex political landscapes throughout her tenure, recognized the implications immediately. The Hayes family's public distribution of information had effectively prevented any quiet containment of potentially embarrassing historical revelations. "I believe," she said after a calculated pause, "that under these unique circumstances, a collaborative approach to preserving and studying these materials would be appropriate. The Treasury Department has established protocols for academic partnerships. In cases of extraordinary historical significance, the careful phrasing represented a significant concession, acknowledgement that standard government containment would not be the approach." Over the next hour, a framework emerged that addressed the core concerns of all parties. The government would maintain technical custody of the financial assets, with a reasonable percentage designated as a finder's fee for the Hayes family. The historical documentation would be preserved through a special academic consortium with representations from major universities and historical institutions, ensuring balanced study and appropriate public access. Most importantly for Jackson, the historical record would acknowledge William Hayes's honorable intentions and 4 generations of family stewardship, preserving a legacy of integrity rather than allowing his great-grandfather to be portrayed as a thief or opportunist. As morning gave way to afternoon, the Hayes farm transformed into a hub of carefully orchestrated activity. Additional specialists arrived to begin the meticulous process of properly removing, documenting, and preserving the repository's contents. Security perimeters were established, media representatives gathered at the property boundary, and the first carefully worded official statements were crafted, acknowledging the discovery's historical significance. Standing on the farmhouse porch, watching the organized recovery operation unfold across their eastern field, Jackson felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that their family legacy would be properly acknowledged. Satisfaction that the historical truths would be preserved without political filtering, and a certain wistfulness as a secret maintained through generations finally ended. Emma joined him, slipping her arm through his as they observed the activity together. "Your father would be proud," she said quietly. "You honored the trust while ensuring the right outcome." "I hope so," Jackson replied, reflecting on the generations of Hayes men who had carried this burden before him. "The farm will survive now. Michael's future is secure. But it's strange to think that after 150 years, our family's greatest secret is finally in the open." Their son approached from the direction of the repository, where he had been assisting the historical documentation team. His expression combined excitement with a young man's attempt at professional composure. "Dr. Ellison wants to know if we have any family records about great-great-grandfather's service beyond what was in the repository," he reported. "They're establishing a chronology of events surrounding the convoy attack and subsequent decisions." The request represented exactly the kind of historical integration the Hayes family had hoped for, their ancestors' actions being studied in proper context rather than judged by modern standards or political convenience. "We'll check the attic. Archives," Emma promised. "There may be letters or military documents we haven't reviewed yet." As Michael returned to the repository site, Jackson's gaze drifted toward the old oak grove beyond the eastern field. For generations, that unremarkable corner of their property had concealed an extraordinary legacy, not just of gold and silver, but of principled choices made in difficult times. "We should plant a marker," he said suddenly, "something to commemorate what happened here. Not just the repository, but the generations of stewardship." Emma nodded in understanding. A reminder that doing the right thing sometimes requires sacrifice and patience, that some truths are worth protecting until the right moment arrives. The afternoon sun illuminated the bustling activity across their land, government vehicles and personnel now working in curious harmony with the academic specialists who would ensure historical accuracy. The Hayes farm had been transformed in ways William could never have imagined when he first buried his secret beneath these fields, from a refuge for hidden truth to a site of historical revelation that would reshape understanding of America's post-Civil War transition. By evening, as the day's work wound down and temporary security lighting illuminated the recovery operation that would continue for days, Jackson found himself alone in his father's study. Robert Hayes had maintained the family secret until his final days, trusting his son to make the right decision when the moment arrived. The responsibility had been heavy, but the outcome, transparency, preservation, and appropriate recognition, seemed to honor the intentions that had guided 4 generations. On his father's desk sat the original map that had started their discovery just days earlier. Jackson studied it with new appreciation, recognizing now that it had been carefully preserved to ensure this moment would eventually arrive. The Hayes family's legacy wasn't the gold beneath their fields, but the integrity that had preserved historical truth across 150 years of changing America. Tomorrow would bring media interviews, formal agreements, and the beginning of a new chapter for both the farm and the Hayes name. But tonight, in the quiet of his father's study, Jackson simply honored the generations of careful stewardship that had made this moment possible. The moment when buried truth finally emerged into light, at exactly the right time, exactly as William Hayes had intended so long ago. Dawn arrived at Whispering Oaks Farm with unusual activity already underway. Government vehicles lined the long driveway leading to the eastern field, and uniformed personnel had established security checkpoints around the perimeter of what was now being called the Hayes Repository Site. News vans gathered at the farm's entrance, held at a respectful distance by state troopers who had been called in to manage the growing media presence. In the farmhouse kitchen, Jackson prepared for what promised to be the most extraordinary day in his family's modern history. The formal announcement of their discovery was scheduled for 10 a.m., a joint press conference with Treasury Department officials that would reveal the existence of one of America's most significant historical finds. "You ready for this?" Emma asked, adjusting his tie, a rarely worn accessory that seemed necessary for the gravity of the occasion. "Not really," Jackson admitted, "but I'm not sure anyone could be ready to announce their family has been sitting on a Civil War treasury for 5 generations. Michael entered from the porch, where he'd been observing the preparations for the press conference. "They've set up a podium near the repository entrance. Dr. Ellison is practically bouncing with excitement, and Director Blackwood looks like she's swallowed something unpleasant." Jackson smiled at the characterization. Their negotiations with Blackwood had resulted in an agreement that largely respected the Hayes family's wishes, while acknowledging the government's authority over the recovered assets. The director had proven herself a pragmatic professional, ultimately recognizing that the family's transparency strategy had created a situation where cooperation offered the best outcome for all parties. The terms they'd finalized the previous evening were straightforward. The physical assets, gold, silver, and currency, would be transferred to Treasury Department custody for proper valuation and preservation. The Hayes family would receive a 15% finder's fee, reflecting both their property rights and generations of stewardship. Most importantly, the historical documents would be entrusted to a specially formed academic consortium that would ensure proper study, preservation, and public access without political filtering. A knock at the door announced the arrival of James Marshall, the attorney who had handled Robert Hayes's estate and now represented the family in their formal agreements with the government. His normally unflappable demeanor showed signs of strain as he entered the kitchen clutching his briefcase. "The final documents are ready for your signature," he reported, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "Treasury Legal has incorporated all our requested amendments regarding academic oversight and historical attribution." As Jackson reviewed the comprehensive agreement that would transform their family's relationship with their land and legacy, Emma fielded a call from the head of the university history department, where she occasionally lectured. The academic community was mobilizing with remarkable speed, already forming the independent consortium that would oversee study of the historical documentation. "They're calling it the Hayes Reconstruction Archive," she reported after ending the call. "Universities from across the country are requesting participation. Your great-grandfather's preservation efforts are being hailed as one of the most significant contributions to Civil War scholarship in the modern era." The recognition of William Hayes's honorable intentions represented a personal victory for Jackson, validation that his ancestor had acted not out of greed, but from principled concern about corruption during a vulnerable period in American history. By 9:30 a.m., the family had completed their legal preparations and made their way toward the eastern field, where the formal announcement would take place. The repository entrance had been secured with professional equipment, and teams of specialists continued the methodical process of documenting and carefully removing its contents under multiple layers of supervision. Dr. Ellison intercepted them. Before they reached the press area, his academic enthusiasm barely contained. "Mr. Hayes, we've made an extraordinary discovery while cataloging the documents this morning." He lowered his voice, despite the security perimeter keeping journalists at a distance. "There's a sealed packet addressed specifically to the President of the United States when these materials are recovered. William Hayes apparently prepared a direct communication to whatever future president would eventually receive these assets." The Taizé revelation added yet another layer to their already remarkable discovery. Jackson's great-grandfather had thought beyond his immediate circumstances, preparing messages not just for his descendants, but for the nation's future leadership. "Has it been opened?" Jackson asked. "No," Dr. Ellison confirmed. "Director Blackwood has designated it for special handling. Given its unique nature, the sealed presidential communication will be transported directly to Washington under diplomatic protocols." The historian's eyes gleamed with scholarly excitement. "Your great-grandfather understood the historical significance of what he was doing, Mr. Hayes. He wasn't just hiding assets, he was preserving a complete record for future generations. The methodical organization, the cross-reference documentation, this wasn't hasty concealment, it was deliberate historical preservation." Before Jackson could respond, a Treasury Department official approached to indicate it was time for them to take their positions for the press announcement. As they moved toward the podium area, Jackson noticed that someone had erected a simple easel displaying a portrait of Captain William Hayes in his Union Army uniform. A photo they had provided from family archives, now enlarged to acknowledge the man whose actions had created this extraordinary moment. Director Blackwood stood at the central podium, flanked by other officials. She gestured for the Hayes family to join them as media cameras focused on the assemblage. Jackson found himself standing before a bank of microphones, the repository entrance visible behind them, feeling the weight of generations as he prepared to publicly reveal what his family had protected for so long. The formal announcement proceeded with government precision. Director Blackwood outlined the discovery in carefully measured terms, acknowledging the Hayes family's cooperation while emphasizing the Treasury Department's authority over the recovered assets. Dr. Ellison spoke with barely restrained academic enthusiasm about the historical significance of the documents, describing them as potentially transformative to our understanding of post-Civil War America. When Jackson's turn came to address the gathered press, he focused on the human story behind the discovery. His great-grandfather's principled decision, generations of family stewardship, and his father's final trust in passing the secret. To him, Captain William Hayes didn't bury these assets for personal gain, he stated, his farmer's voice carrying across the hushed gathering. He protected them during a period when he feared they would be misappropriated by corruption. 4 generations of my family have honored that protection, often at significant personal cost. Today, we're not just recovering gold and silver, but historical truth that has waited 150 years to be properly acknowledged. The questions that followed ranged from technical inquiries about the repository's construction to more pointed investigations of the political implications of the historical documents. Jackson deferred the academic questions to Dr. Ellison and Emma, whose expertise provided context that simple news headlines could not capture. When asked about the finder's fee arrangement, Jackson emphasized that while the financial compensation would secure his family's farm for future generations, the more meaningful outcome was proper historical recognition of William Hayes' honorable service. My great-grandfather could have used this wealth to become one of the richest men in Illinois, Jackson noted. Instead, he lived modestly as a farmer, protecting these assets for their eventual return when he believed the country had achieved the integrity necessary to use them as originally intended. That kind of principled sacrifice deserves recognition beyond monetary value. As the formal press conference concluded, the media's attention shifted to the practical aspects of the recovery operation. Teams of specialists in historical preservation, currency valuation, and security continued their methodical work, creating what one reporter described as a historical excavation site, meeting a gold vault inventory. The initial valuation estimates transmitted from Treasury specialists were staggering. The gold and silver alone, at current market prices, exceeded $200 million. The rare currency and bonds represented additional value as both financial and historical artifacts. The 15% finder's fee would not only secure the Hayes Farm's continued operation, but establish a foundation that could support agricultural preservation throughout their community. By mid-afternoon, the family found themselves in the surreal position of watching their eastern field transformed into a high-security government operation while fielding calls from national media, academic institutions, and even distant relatives who had seen the news reports. The secret that had been so carefully guarded for generations was now headline news across the country, with historical implications still being assessed by scholars eager to access the preserved documents. Dr. Ellison found Jackson observing the activity from the shade of an old oak tree that had stood sentinel over the hidden repository for generations. "Your family has given American history an extraordinary gift," the historian said, joining him in contemplation of the busy scene. "These documents will fill crucial gaps in our understanding of Lincoln's final intentions for Reconstruction. The evidence of corruption they contain will require reassessment of several historical figures whose legacies have been perhaps overly burnished by selective historical accounts." "Will it change anything?" Jackson asked, considering the practical impact beyond academic circles. After 150 years, does revealing this truth still matter? Dr. Ellison considered the question with scholarly seriousness. "History isn't just about documenting the past, Mr. Hayes. It's about understanding the paths not taken, the opportunities missed, the decisions that shaped our present. These documents reveal Lincoln's more comprehensive vision for healing the nation, approaches abandoned after his assassination. Understanding that lost potential helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time." The historian gestured toward the repository entrance, where carefully packed document containers were being transferred to specialized transport vehicles. Your great-grandfather preserved not just assets, but a vision of what America might have become had different choices been made after the war. That vision still has power to inform our present challenges. As evening approached, Jackson found a moment of quiet reflection on the farmhouse porch, the same spot where generations of Hayes men had contemplated their relationship with the land and the secret beneath it. Emma joined him, bringing coffee, and a quiet presence that acknowledged the emotional complexity of the day. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling beside him on the porch swing that had been his father's favorite spot. "Like a chapter is ending," Jackson admitted. "For 5 generations, protecting that repository has been part of what defined our family. Now it's become public knowledge, part of a larger historical narrative that goes beyond us. But your family's role in that narrative is secure," Emma reminded him. "William Hayes won't be remembered as someone who took advantage of chaos for personal gain, but as someone who protected both physical assets and historical truth during a vulnerable time." Jackson nodded, finding comfort in that recognition. Dad would have approved of how this turned out. The farm is secure, the truth is preserved, and William's honor is acknowledged. Their conversation was interrupted by Michael, who emerged from the house with his laptop. "You need to see this," he said urgently, setting the computer before them. On screen was a live news broadcast from Washington, where the Treasury Secretary was making a formal statement about the Hayes repository discovery. "Represents one of the most significant historical finds of the century," the Secretary was saying. "The recovered assets will be preserved with appropriate recognition of the Hayes family's generations of stewardship. More significantly, the historical documentation provides unprecedented insight into a critical period of American transition." The camera cut to footage of armored vehicles arriving at a secure government facility, presumably carrying the first shipments from the repository. The news anchor's voiceover provided context. "Sources within the administration indicate that the sealed presidential message discovered in the Hayes repository has been delivered directly to the White House. While its contents remain confidential, officials describe it as a remarkable communication across time, from Captain William Hayes to our current president." Michael closed the laptop, his expression reflecting the same mix of pride and wonder that Jackson felt. Great-great-grandfather's message finally reached its destination after 150 years. Whatever he wrote, it's being read by the president tonight. The thought created a profound connection across generations. William Hayes, writing with the perspective of having just survived America's bloodiest conflict, had prepared guidance for a future president who would receive his carefully preserved legacy. As darkness settled over the farm, the recovery operation continued under powerful lights that transformed night into day around the repository entrance. Security remained tight, with rotating teams ensuring continuous supervision of the extraction process that would likely continue for several more days. In the farmhouse dining room, Jackson, Emma, and Michael gathered for a late supper, joined by James Marshall, who had remained to handle the growing administrative complexities of their situation. The attorney provided updates on the formal agreements being processed through government channels and the initial financial arrangements that would secure the family's future. The university consortium is already establishing protocols for scholarly access to the documents, he reported between bites of Emma's hastily prepared pasta. They're particularly interested in having Michael involved, given his direct family connection. Several history departments have expressed interest in supporting his studies if he wants to pursue that direction. The young man looked up from his plate, surprised. "Me? I'm studying agricultural engineering, not history. Perspectives from outside traditional historical disciplines are actually highly valued," Emma explained. Your understanding of the farm, the land, and your family's relationship with both provides context that academic historians might miss. The conversation continued, exploring the unexpected opportunities emerging from their discovery. Beyond the finder's fee that would secure the farm's operations, the Hayes family's unique position as guardians of this historical legacy created possibilities none of them had anticipated. Academic partnerships, historical preservation initiatives, even educational programs centered on principled decision-making during periods of national transition. Late that night, when the house had finally grown quiet and the exhaustion of recent days caught up with him, Jackson found himself alone in his father's study once more. The room felt different now, unburdened of the secret that had influenced their family for generations. On the desk lay the latest newspaper, its front page dominated by images of the repository and headlines declaring Civil War treasury discovered on Illinois farm. Beside it sat his father's journal, the one that had contained the map leading to their discovery. Jackson opened it to the final entry, written in Robert's increasingly frail handwriting just days before his death. I have carried this knowledge as my father did before me, and his father before him. Each generation must decide whether the moment has come for revelation. I leave this choice to my son, trusting his judgment as my father trusted mine. The burden is heavy, but the purpose remains true, to protect not just wealth but truth, until both can serve their proper purpose. Robert Hayes had passed both burden and trust to his son, confident in Jackson's ability to recognize when the right moment had arrived. As Jackson closed the journal, he felt a sense of completion, not just of his father's final request, but of a generational mission that had begun in the chaotic aftermath of America's Civil War. Outside, the lights of the recovery operation illuminated the eastern field, where William Hayes had buried his extraordinary legacy 150 years earlier. Tomorrow would bring new developments, formal agreements, and continued media attention. But tonight, in the quiet of his father's study, Jackson simply honored the chain of trust that had linked 5 generations of his family, a lineage defined not by the gold they had protected, but by the integrity with which they had carried that protection forward until the proper time for revelation had finally arrived. 1 week after the discovery of the Hayes repository, the eastern field of Whispering Oaks Farm had transformed into a scene unlike anything the quiet rural community had ever witnessed. White canopy tents housing specialized preservation teams surrounded the repository entrance, their clinical precision contrasting sharply with the surrounding cornfields. A temporary security fence enclosed the entire operation, with uniformed personnel maintaining a perimeter that kept the still persistent media at a respectful distance. Inside the main processing tent, Jackson observed the continuing cataloging of the repository's contents with a mixture of wonder and detachment. The methodical government operation had an almost ceremonial quality, specialists in conservation-grade gloves carefully transferring documents to acid-free containers, Treasury officials logging each financial asset with redundant verification, and security personnel maintaining constant supervision throughout the process. The extraction is approximately 70% complete, reported Leslie Winters, the senior Treasury official who had replaced Director Blackwood as on-site coordinator 3 days earlier. We anticipate completing the physical recovery by Friday, though the full documentation and preservation process will continue for months. Jackson nodded, still adjusting to the strange reality that objects hidden beneath his family's land for generations were now being systematically removed, categorized, and prepared for transport to secure government facilities. The artifacts that remained, primarily historical documents requiring specialized preservation, represented the most historically significant portions of William Hayes's legacy, "Has there been any word about the presidential message?" he asked, referring to the sealed communication his great-grandfather had prepared for whichever president would eventually receive the repository's contents. Winter's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm not privy to communications at that level, Mr. Hayes. Any response would come through diplomatic channels rather than our recovery operation." As he exited the processing tent, Jackson found Emma deep in conversation with Dr. Veronica Chen, the newly appointed academic director of the Hayes Reconstruction Archive Consortium. The two women had developed an immediate professional rapport, their shared commitment to historical integrity creating a natural alliance. "We've secured commitments from 16 universities and 3 major historical foundations," Dr. Chen was explaining, her tablet displaying an organizational chart of the rapidly forming academic partnership. "The initial preservation work will happen at the National Archives, but research access will be distributed across multiple institutions to ensure balanced scholarly perspective." Emma noticed Jackson's approach and included him in the conversation. "Dr. Chen has invited me to join the initial documentation team as a family representative. They want to ensure the Hayes perspective is incorporated into the archival framing. The inclusion represented a significant acknowledgement of the family's historical connection and Emma's professional qualifications." Jackson felt a surge of pride in his wife's recognition among the academic community, now converging around their discovery. "We believe context is crucial when presenting historical materials of this significance," Dr. Chen explained. "Your family's understanding of William Hayes's intentions provides essential perspective that outside scholars might miss. These documents didn't survive by accident. They were deliberately preserved by generations of your family, and that stewardship is part of their historical significance." As they discussed the academic consortium's plans, Michael approached from the direction of the farmhouse, accompanied by a man Jackson didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing a well-tailored suit that immediately marked him as neither local nor part of the recovery operation. "Dad, this is Mr. Harrington from the White House Office of Correspondence," Michael introduced them, a hint of excitement in his normally composed demeanor. "He's here about great-great-grandfather's letter." The visitor extended his hand with practiced diplomacy. "Thomas Harrington, Mr. Hayes. I'm here as a special envoy regarding the sealed presidential communication recovered from the repository. The President has requested your family's presence at a private meeting in Washington tomorrow afternoon." The unexpected invitation momentarily left Jackson speechless. Emma stepped into the conversation with her usual grace. "The President wants to meet with us personally. May I ask why?" Harrington's professional smile revealed little. After receiving Captain Hayes's communication, the President believes a direct discussion with the Hayes family would be appropriate. "I'm not authorized to share specific details, but I can tell you the President was deeply moved by your ancestors' message and wishes to acknowledge its significance personally." The formal invitation transformed their already extraordinary week into something that bordered on surreal. Arrangements were quickly established for the Hayes family to fly to Washington the following morning on a government transport, with accommodations at the historic Willard Hotel near the White House. As Harrington departed with confirmed details, the family retreated to the farmhouse to process this latest development. The kitchen that had been their war room during the discovery now became a planning center for an unexpected presidential audience. "What do you even wear to meet the President?" Michael wondered aloud, his young adult confidence momentarily shaken by the prospect. "Something respectful but not pretentious," Emma advised practically. "We're representing the family, not trying to impress with fashion." Jackson found himself more concerned with substance than appearance. "I wonder what William wrote that would prompt a personal meeting. It must have been something beyond historical documentation or financial accounting. Their speculation continued through the evening, interrupted by periodic phone calls from media outlets that had somehow learned of their impending Washington visit, despite the White House's attempt at discretion. By unspoken agreement, the family deflected these inquiries, preserving the private nature of the upcoming meeting. Morning brought a flurry of preparation as they packed for an overnight stay in the capital. The government transport, a sleek executive jet rather than the military transport they had expected, arrived at the regional airport promptly at 9 a.m. The flight crew treated them with a deference that suggested their mission carried significant official importance. The 2-hour flight gave Jackson time to reflect on the extraordinary trajectory that had brought them to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he had been a struggling farmer facing potential foreclosure, carrying the weight of his father's recent death, with no knowledge of the secret that had shaped his family for generations. Now he was flying to Washington to meet the president regarding a letter written by his great-grandfather 150 years earlier. Upon landing, they were met by a State Department liaison who escorted them through expedited security and into a waiting government vehicle. The drive from Andrews Air Force Base to downtown Washington provided Michael his first glimpse of the capital, his excitement breaking through the nervous anticipation they all felt. The Willard Hotel's historic elegance only heightened the surreal quality of their journey. Checking into a suite arranged by the White House, they found themselves with several hours before their scheduled meeting. Emma suggested using the time to visit the National Archives, where the first documents from the Hayes repository had already been transferred for preservation. It might help ground us before the meeting, she reasoned. Remember why all of this matters beyond the spectacle. Their State Department escort arranged immediate access to the archive's specialized preservation area, where Dr. Ellison greeted them with evident pleasure. The historian had transferred from the field operation to oversee the initial archival process, ensuring scholarly integrity throughout the transition. "You've arrived at a perfect moment," he told them, leading the way through security protocols to a specialized preservation laboratory where several conservators were working with documents from the repository. "We've just completed initial stabilization of what we believe is the most historically significant set of papers, Lincoln's final reconstruction directives that were presumed lost during the chaos following his assassination. Under carefully controlled lighting, they observed white-glove specialists gently transferring fragile pages to preservation-grade housing. The reverence with which these professionals handled William Hayes's preserved documents reinforced the historical significance of what their family had protected through generations. These papers will fundamentally reshape our understanding of Lincoln's vision for post-war reconciliation," Dr. Ellison explained, his academic excitement evident despite the laboratory's hushed atmosphere. "The directives outline a more gradual, economically integrated approach than what was ultimately implemented after Johnson assumed the presidency." He directed their attention to a particular document behind preservation glass, its handwritten text still legible despite its age. This memorandum, dated April 13, 1865, just one day before the assassination, outlines Lincoln's intention to establish economic partnerships between former plantation owners and freed slaves, creating a transitional ownership model that might have prevented some of the most destructive aspects of Reconstruction's failure. The historian's explanation provided context that newspaper headlines could never capture: the true historical significance beyond the sensational discovery of gold and currency. William Hayes hadn't merely preserved financial assets, he had protected historical truth that might have changed America's developmental trajectory had it been implemented rather than lost. Following their archives visit, the family returned to the hotel to prepare for their White House meeting. A package had been delivered during their absence, formal visitor credentials and a printed invitation bearing the presidential seal. The official nature of these materials reinforced the gravity of the occasion awaiting them. At precisely 3:30 p.m., their State Department escort arrived to accompany them to the White House. The approach through security checkpoints and into the executive complex proceeded with practiced efficiency that somehow managed to feel both welcoming and appropriately solemn. Rather than the Oval Office setting portrayed in films and television, they were led to a more intimate meeting room in the executive residence, a deliberate choice that suggested a personal rather than purely official encounter. Thomas Harrington, who had delivered their invitation at the farm, greeted them and confirmed that the president would join them momentarily. This is being treated as a private historical discussion rather than a formal state meeting, he explained, indicating comfortable seating arranged around a coffee table rather than an imposing conference setup. The president wanted to create an environment conducive to meaningful conversation about your ancestors' legacy. Minutes later, the room's atmosphere shifted as security personnel took positions, and the President of the United States entered without fanfare. The nation's leader moved with the confident informality of someone in their personal residence, greeting each family member with a handshake and genuine words of welcome that immediately eased the tension Jackson had been carrying. "The Hayes family," the president acknowledged, taking a seat across from them. "I've been looking forward to this conversation since receiving your great-grandfather's remarkable message." Few presidents have the opportunity to receive correspondence from 1865 with direct relevance to current challenges. A staff member presented an acid-free preservation folder from which the president carefully extracted what was clearly William Hayes's sealed letter, now professionally preserved, but with its original wax seal broken. The document was placed on a conservation stand between them, visible to all but handled with appropriate care. Before discussing specific contents, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary service your family has provided to our nation. The president began. For 5 generations, the Hayes family protected not just valuable assets, but historical truth during periods when that truth might have been suppressed or misused. That kind of principled stewardship deserves national recognition. The president gestured to Harrington, who presented Jackson with a small leather case. Inside lay a medal he recognized immediately, the Presidential Citizens Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. This is being awarded posthumously to Captain William Hayes for exceptional service to the nation during and after the Civil War, the president explained. The citation acknowledges both his military service and his extraordinary decision to preserve historical assets at great personal sacrifice. Similar recognition will be extended to each generation of your family who maintained this protection, including your father, Robert Hayes. The formal acknowledgement of his ancestors' service brought unexpected emotion to Jackson's throat. The presidential recognition transformed what might have been perceived as concealment into recognized patriotic stewardship, exactly the historical understanding he had hoped would emerge from their discovery. "Thank you, Mr. President," he managed, accepting the medal with reverence. "My family never sought recognition, but knowing their intentions are understood means a great deal. Intentions matter profoundly in how we judge historical actions," the president observed, turning attention to the preserved letter. "Which brings me to the remarkable message your great-grandfather prepared for whoever would occupy this office when his repository was finally discovered." With careful movements that respected the document's fragility, the president indicated key passages from William Hayes' letter. Captain Hayes wrote this with extraordinary foresight, addressing not the president of his time, but whoever would lead the nation when historical circumstances finally brought his hidden cache to light. The president continued, summarizing rather than directly reading the historic document. He expresses hope that by the time this letter is read, the wounds of civil conflict will have fully healed. He acknowledges his unconventional decision to protect these assets from what he describes as corruption that reaches into the highest offices, but frames this action as a trust rather than appropriation. Emma, her historian's curiosity evident, respectfully asked, did he explain why he felt compelled to maintain secrecy rather than reporting through official channels? With remarkable specificity, the president confirmed, he names several officials in the Johnson administration whom he believed were compromised, describes witnessing transactions that convinced him official repositories were being systematically misappropriated, and outlines his attempts to report through proper channels before making his difficult decision. The president turned to another section of the letter. Most compelling is his vision for how these resources might eventually serve their intended purpose. He writes, "When my trust is finally discovered, I pray it comes at a moment when our nation has achieved the moral clarity to use these assets for their original purpose, the true reconstruction of our union through educational opportunity. For all citizens, regardless of their former condition of servitude, economic partnerships that create shared prosperity and reconciliation based on justice rather than expediency." Michael, who had remained respectfully silent, couldn't contain his curiosity. He specifically outlined how the assets should be used. With the humility of suggesting rather than demanding, the president noted, he acknowledges that future generations would face challenges he couldn't anticipate, but offers his perspective as someone who witnessed both the war's devastation and the missed opportunities of its aftermath. The president set the document aside and leaned forward slightly, shifting from historical reflection to present purpose. Which brings us to why I requested this meeting rather than simply sending formal acknowledgement. Captain Hayes's suggestion that these recovered assets be dedicated to educational opportunity and economic partnership remains profoundly relevant to our current national challenges. What followed was an extraordinary conversation about the potential establishment of a Hayes Legacy Foundation that would honor William's vision through modern application. The president proposed dedicating the government's portion of the recovered assets, after the family's finder's fee, to educational initiatives focused on historical understanding, economic opportunity in underserved communities, and projects that built shared prosperity across traditional divides. Rather than simply absorbing these assets into general treasury funds, we have the opportunity to honor your ancestors' intentions by creating lasting impact, the president explained. The foundation would operate independently with appropriate oversight, guided by both historical scholars and practical innovators in education and community development. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, exploring potential structures and approaches that would translate William Hayes's 1865 vision into meaningful 21st century impact. Throughout the discussion, Jackson was struck by how thoroughly his great-grandfather's intentions had been understood and respected, not merely acknowledged as historical curiosity, but embraced as relevant guidance for contemporary challenges. As their meeting concluded, the president offered a final reflection that captured the extraordinary connection between past and present their discovery had created. Captain Hayes made a difficult choice in extraordinary circumstances, trusting future generations to complete what his own time couldn't accomplish. Your family honored that trust through 150 years of dedicated stewardship. Now we have the privilege of fulfilling his vision, not just by recovering these assets, but by dedicating them to the national healing and shared prosperity he hoped would eventually emerge from our greatest national conflict. 6 months after the discovery of the Hayes repository, Jackson stood at the edge of what had once been the Eastern Field, now transformed into something his ancestors could never have imagined. The Hayes Center for Historical Reconciliation rose from the very spot where the repository had been hidden, a striking modern structure of glass and limestone that seemed to emerge organically from the Illinois farmland. Today marked its official opening, with dignitaries, academics, and media gathering for the dedication ceremony. The building's central atrium featured a life-sized bronze statue of Captain William Hayes, depicted not in military glory, but as a farmer with one hand on a plough and the other holding a journal, representing the dual legacy of working the land while protecting historical truth. "Quite a change from corn," Michael remarked, joining his father at the observation point. The young man had found an unexpected calling in the wake of their discovery, deferring his return to agricultural college to serve as the family's representative. In the Hayes Legacy Foundation, his natural understanding of both farming practicality and historical significance had made him an invaluable bridge between academic researchers and practical implementation. "I think William would approve," Jackson replied, watching as Emma guided a group of university officials through the center's main exhibition hall, using the land to cultivate understanding instead of just crops. The Hayes Center represented only one aspect of their discovery's lasting impact. The Hayes Legacy Foundation, established with presidential support and funded by a significant portion of the recovered assets, had already launched educational initiatives in 50 communities across the country. The Foundation's mission, directly inspired by William Hayes's sealed letter, focused on historical reconciliation, educational opportunity, and economic partnerships across traditional divides. The family's 15% finder's fee had secured not just Whispering Oaks Farm's future, but enabled them to establish a regional agricultural preservation trust that protected dozens of family farms from corporate consolidation. Jackson had discovered that financial security didn't diminish his connection to farming, but allowed him to approach it with innovation rather than desperate necessity. As visitors began gathering for the dedication ceremony, Jackson noticed Dr. Chen approaching with a distinguished elderly gentleman he didn't recognize. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted him warmly, "I'd like to introduce Professor James Latimer from Howard University. He's completed the initial analysis of the Lincoln Reconstruction Directives and has some remarkable findings to share." The professor, well into his 80s, but sharp-eyed and energetic, extended a weathered hand. "Mr. Hayes, your family's preservation efforts have given us an extraordinary window into what might have been. Lincoln's final economic integration plans were far more progressive than anything attempted during actual Reconstruction. Had these directives been implemented rather than lost, our nation's trajectory might have been fundamentally altered." "For better?" Jackson asked, always more interested in practical outcomes than academic theories. "Almost certainly," the professor confirmed. "The economic partnership model Lincoln outlined would have created shared prosperity rather than exploitative sharecropping. His phased voting rights protection would have prevented the violent disenfranchisement that followed. Most significantly, his education initiatives would have established a foundation for genuine opportunity decades before such programs were actually attempted." The professor's assessment validated what Jackson had come to believe, that his great-grandfather had protected not just valuable assets, but alternative possibilities that might still inform contemporary solutions. William Hayes hadn't been merely hiding gold and silver. He'd been preserving a vision of what America might have become had different choices been made. As the dedication ceremony began, Jackson took his place on the stage alongside government officials, academic partners, and community representatives. The president, unable to attend in person, appeared via video link to acknowledge the extraordinary partnership that had emerged from the Hayes discovery. When Jackson's turn came to address the gathering, he spoke not from prepared remarks, but from the farmer's directness that defined his family through generations. "My great-grandfather buried a treasure beneath our cornfield in 1865, he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. But the real treasure wasn't gold or silver, it was truth, historical truth that offered alternatives to the path our nation actually followed. For 5 generations, my family protected that truth, waiting for the right moment when it might serve its proper purpose." He gestured toward the center behind him, its modern lines contrasting with the traditional farmland surrounding it. "This center represents not just what we found beneath our fields, but what we can still build with that knowledge. History isn't just about understanding what happened. It's about recognizing the paths not taken, the possibilities that still remain available if we have the wisdom to see them." As applause greeted his words, Jackson looked out over the gathered crowd and beyond to the farmland that had sustained his family through generations of patient stewardship. The Hayes legacy had transformed from secret burden to public inspiration, from hidden repository to open possibility. "Today isn't just about celebrating a historical discovery," he concluded, sensing William's presence in that moment across the centuries. "It's about recognizing that buried beneath the surface of our common history lie alternative paths, better possibilities, and second chances waiting to be uncovered by those with the courage to dig deep enough." The eastern cornfield that had concealed America's secret for 150 years now offered its harvest to future generations, not in crops, but in understanding, not in concealed gold, but in revealed truth. And in that transformation, the Hayes family had fulfilled their ancestors' trust in the most profound way possible, by ensuring that what had been buried in secrecy could finally flourish in the light. If this story of hidden treasures and family legacy spoke to you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We unearth extraordinary tales like this every week, stories that reveal how ordinary people sometimes guard extraordinary secrets. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now, because next week we'll be sharing the shocking discovery made beneath an abandoned lighthouse that rewrote maritime history forever. Some secrets are meant to be discovered. Don't miss being part of the revelation.